and when did you start thinking from an evolutionary perspective?
It's pretty basic. Probably like a lot of people, I took some really interesting classes as an undergrad. I had some really great professors that sparked my interest. I really didn't know anything about evolutionary theory when I first went to college. And I had a seminar where we read Darwin's Origin and then later Descent of Man, and we had a project where we were supposed to trace out sort of the history of an idea, an evolutionary idea. So I had been interested in mate choice and attractiveness, you know, in general, and I knew sexual selection theory had something to do with that, so I picked that as my topic, and it turned out to really lead on and on and on to lots of other things. I just felt like you know, natural selection, but sexual selection in particular, had such explanatory power for the different things that I was interested in, and it just kept snowballing one thing into the next, and here I am, many years later, still interested.
So Kristin, can you explain sexual selection theory?
Yeah, for sure. So this was Darwin's second big idea, right? So famously, he said that the sight of a peacock's tail made him sick, which is kind of a funny thing to say. But the reason he said that was because, you know, when he first laid out his theory of natural selection, it was all about the ability to survive and pass on your genes to the next generation, and he felt like these extravagant traits like peacock's tails or enormous antlers on certain types of deer seemed like an obvious hindrance to the ability to survive. You know, a big fancy tail on a peacock makes it hard to fly, hard to get away from predators, makes it really obvious. So he felt like the presence of these extravagant traits was potentially undermining, you know, his original theory of natural selection. But he came up with an idea that salvaged that, which was that if a trait makes you more likely to acquire mates, even if it interferes with your ability to survive, it will increase your reproductive success. It will increase your ability to pass on copies of those genes and copies of the genes for the extravagant trait. And so that explained the peacock's tail and a lot of traits like that. And so it's sort of divided into two different aspects. One would be a competition side of things. So if there are traits that help you to compete with members of your own sex, so females competing with females, or typically it's often understood as males competing with males, anything that's going to help you compete better is going to help you to acquire more mates because you're a better competitor. That will be a sexually selected trait. The other sort of flip side of that is more about choice over mates, preferences for traits. And so any trait that you possess that makes you more attractive to members of the opposite sex would also be sexually selected. And so it's sort of understood in two ways, but there's obvious ways that they interact, right? So you can be more attractive to members of the opposite sex because you're good at competing with members of the same sex, right? Those two things can blend together and often do. But it's often understood in terms of those two things. And so in Darwin's day, the sort of Victorian era sensibilities didn't give much weight to the idea of female choice, that females could have that much sort of control and power over the ultimate sort of evolutionary trajectory of our species. And so most of the focus at that time was on male competition, but more recently in the last few decades, it has really shifted to mating preferences and ideas of human attractiveness is really what's sort of the hot item in the last few decades. And so my research is a little different in that I'm sort of shifting the focus back a little bit to competition, and particularly male competition and sort of the classic formulation there. But what I'm interested in, whereas when you look at these different species like peacocks or deer, bighorn sheep that compete by, you know, clashing their heads together, having these big horns, it doesn't really work that way with humans, right? Our you know, violence in that regard is sort of frowned upon, although obviously that happens, right? You can go out to the bars. There's, you know, lots of mate competition of the direct sort of violent type, but it takes a lot of more indirect forms for humans, right? And so what I'm interested in is sort of the cultural elements rather than the physical traits that individuals possess, but sort of the cultural features of different societies that can aid individuals in mate competition and also make them more attractive as mates. And so, you know, obviously this has a lot to do with social hierarchies, right? So if you rank high in a social hierarchy, that can help you to get reproductive success in multiple ways. In one way, it can help you to succeed in competition, right? You have obvious advantages over individuals that are lower ranking in terms of your access to resources, whether that's money or education or depending on the type of society you live in, cattle or some food source or whatever the case may be. Being high ranking, obviously assists individuals, males in that regard, but it can also make you more attractive. If females prefer males that are high ranking, for whatever reason, which lots of research shows that many females do find that attractive in mates, then that will also aid high ranking males to get better access to mates. So social hierarchies can help high-ranking males both to compete and to be found more attractive by females. So it's a very powerful way of gaining reproductive success, being high-ranking.
So Kristin, what is the relationship between evolution and American racial politics?
So America's kind of had a built-in racial hierarchy from our very earliest beginnings, right? Because of the African slave trade, right? So, which put people without question into a subordinate or dominant position in that regard, very obvious when there's a slave-owner relationship, right? So that's the beginnings of an early hierarchy that obviously puts higher-ranking individuals at an advantage in terms of resource capacities over subordinate males, and extracting the labor and things of subordinate males to increase their own success in the world. So that's a cultural feature, right? The idea of slavery, that you can enslave an individual, a whole race of people in your particular country, and that no one's going to interfere with your, at that time, your right to do that.
So Kristin, how did ideology, myths, and stereotypes reinforce the unequal relationships between African Americans and Euro-Americans?
That follows directly from the slavery context, where most people, I would think, that are familiar with American history know that there was a great deal of race mixing in the plantation settings, right? But it wasn't consensual most of the time, right? And it was occurring between the Euro-American males of the sort of dominant group and the subordinate females, which were African-American females. And it wasn't happening nearly with that frequency between Euro-American females and the African-American males, right? There was a lot of effort put to prevent that type of race mixing, but the other type of race mixing was quite frequent, and so there was this kind of conflict where there's this adamant opposition to race mixing as sort of the dominant ideology, and yet it's occurring all the time. And so how do you reconcile that? And so part of sort of in a psychological sense, these stereotypes of the different groups were set up that sort of aided the ability to reconcile this conflict. So you've got these chaste white women, the Southern belle, who's placed on a pedestal of sort of purity and virginity, right? And she's too pure and fragile and gentle for any kind of sort of true sexual gratification, right? And then you've got these black males who are portrayed as sexually savage, right, predatory, some sort of sexual threat, ever present, trying to prey upon these white women. And so then that introduces the role of the white male, who's there to defend the white woman and her purity from these savage black males. But they've got their own sort of struggle, which is to stave off these advances, right, from the black females. They're not who are promiscuous, right, and are lustful. And so this sort of construction of these stereotypes, depending on the race and the gender of the individuals involved, is a defense where for the dominant males to continue doing what they're doing, to continue to treat black males very badly because they are a threat and they need to be controlled, and also treat black women very badly and take advantage of them, and flipping it around like, well, they're the ones that are pursuing us. And so it's sort of maintained, and this is the sort of cultural elements that I'm talking about, these stereotypes, these myths and narratives that sort of the American ideologies, racial ideologies, constructed and set this system in motion and continue to support this system, which ultimately allowed white males, which were the dominant males in this particular situation, opened up their access to mates, and seriously constricted the access to mates of subordinate males. And so from an evolutionary perspective, we've got these cultural elements totally serving the purposes of a larger evolutionary sort of natural selection, passing on of the genes imperative.
So Kristin, how does dominance hierarchies serve reproduction?
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of the thing that I'm talking about. So if there are hierarchies in place, that allows particular males, the ones that are higher ranking, to, I think what Ellis said was, accumulate resources inequitably, where was his sort of phrase, and which I think says a lot there, which is the idea that you can, if there's a hierarchy in place, everything sort of flows upwards, and so the resources accumulate at the top amongst the males that are at the top, which resources are a very important factor in controlling the mate choices of other individuals in society, restricting those, and being more attractive yourself in terms of your own mate value. And so, this is not just the case for humans. Lots of group animals have social hierarchies, and very, very frequently, that's the high-ranking males that have access to the females in the group, and the low-ranking males, dare they attempt to have sexual access to the females, there's serious violent repercussions for that. And so humans, again, it's not different in this sort of overall a function of this system. It just takes on a slightly different appearance because we have so many cultural ballasts for this system, things that justify it, that make it seem like the way that things should occur, and sort of grant individuals authority, which is something baboons don't have. Right? They just have fangs, and as long as they can fight, they stay at the top, right? But once they get weak and old, that's the end of it. As soon as another individual can come along and physically beat them, that's definitely not the case for humans, right? We have a very high-ranking elderly folks that could never win at a physical contest, but that's not what it's about. It's a cultural contest for authority in a social hierarchy.
Kristin, what are some of the inequalities that affect African Americans today?
A litany of inequalities, and most of the things that you would maybe inquire about in terms of educational attainment, socioeconomic status, all sorts of variables about occupational status, and all of these things, you find the disparities across the board. The one that I'm most familiar with are disparities in the criminal justice system, law enforcement, and in the courts, and mass incarceration is alarming. And these are not things you're going to hear about on the evening news, to the point where people don't realize the levels of inequities that are currently faced with in this country. First of all, a lot of people don't realize that it is an era of mass incarceration, that the United States has more people per capita in prison than any other country in the entire world, which is not probably the thing America wants to be number one in, right? But we are, and most people don't realize that. And so, you have to ask, why are so many people in prison? Are we more criminally inclined, or what's the deal here? And the number of prisoners has increased 5 times in the last 30 years. So
how do you relate mating competition with the data?
Obviously, like I was saying, how authority is a major factor. And so this, obviously, we call them the authorities, right? The police and judges and things have tremendous power to control the fates of individuals in terms of whether they'll go to jail for a crime, how long they'll go to jail for that crime, whether or not they'll actually see a judge or have a trial, or whether they'll have to take a plea bargain, whether or not they'll get paroled. All of these things have a lot of control, and it's discretionary. And I think that's the important thing. And what I mean by that is that it's not the same in every single case. Judges and police officers have discretion. So, for instance, every time you get pulled over for speeding, you don't necessarily get a ticket. Sometimes you get a warning, right? And that's at the police officers' discretion. And so what we find that this is where the racial disparities enter in, is this use of discretion. So there are enormous differences, particularly for drug crimes, right? So the war on drugs is now infamous at this point. This is the reason we have 5 times as many people in prison in the last 30 years than we did 30 years ago, is not because there's an increase in property crimes or violent crimes, it's drug crimes. And 75% of the people that are in prison for drug crimes are either Black or Latino. And so most people's reaction to that is because they're the people that are doing and selling drugs, because that's sort of the prevailing belief. But that is, in fact, not true. The drug use among different racial categories is pretty much consistent. Most recent data is from 2010, and it finds that about 9% of white Americans have used drugs in the last month, about 10% of Black Americans have used drugs in the last month, and about 8% of Hispanic Americans have used drugs in the last month. So the numbers, as far as the amount of use, is consistent. Now, how that becomes 75% up to 90% in some parts of America of the people who are actually in jail for that crime are Black and Latino, that's where the discretion comes in, right? It's all about a discretionary enforcement of these drug laws. And so people believe that there's that many African American and Hispanic males in prison for drugs because they're the ones that are doing the drugs. And that somehow white people aren't doing drugs, and that's why they're not in prison for that. But that's obviously not the case. And so this is sort of to bring it back, yes, like you're saying, to sexual selection. I mean, it's a great way to remove males, right?
So, Kristin, is the criminal justice system being used to incapacitate African American males from the mating market?
That's a good way to put it. In fact, that's one of the ways Jim Sidanius puts it, not necessarily in specifically for incarceration, but that is sort of the way that this whole sexual competition game plays out, is that there's racism in America. I mean, most people are familiar with that, but it's different how it's directed towards what you might call subordinate males and subordinate females. It's the way it's experienced and the way that sort of the action that it takes is different. And when it's directed at males, this is the word he uses, incapacitate. It's sort of an attempt to incapacitate them, damage them, harm them in a way because they are possible mate competitors. The forms of prejudice and discrimination that tend to be directed towards minority females, subordinate females, are more in an attempt to control them, to not give them choices when it comes to who they would mate with or who their best options are. All the males that are available are of this particular group of males, and then you've controlled their access in that way. Or you certainly, if we go back to the slavery example, rape on the plantations, it's not an attempt to kill females, their potential mates. Why would you want to do that? It's an attempt to control them. And so another good example of that is lynching. People, rightly consider that as a horrible expression of anti-Black racism, and of course it is, but if you look at the numbers, 98% of lynching victims were male. Right. So if it was all about just, we hate Black people, so that's how we're going to handle things, why would there be such a sex bias in the people that were victims of those crimes? And so, yes, exactly. All these things play out. This is why, you talk about how many Black people are in jail, you're really talking about how many Black males are in jail. It's vastly more males than females.
Right. So final question, how can your explanatory framework help prevent discrimination and inequality?
Well, I think it's important. I think first and foremost, it's very much under wraps. It's not something that's brought to the surface. I think that people don't realize that oftentimes these things are not so much about race per se, but about sex, and they don't, because we don't think that way. We overlook the sort of sometimes obvious ways that it's a matter of mate competition. And so, sure, when individual police officers are acting in a discriminatory way, or judges are giving harsher sentences, or people are believing these stereotypes that Black males are sexual predators, and they're internalizing all of this. They're not aware of it in a sense of something that's evolved as a mate competition strategy. And so I think just by maybe changing the way we perceive of these things and being more aware of the way that these ideologies serve some ulterior motive. Just that simple awareness can be very helpful. To people are aware of their behavior and their own motivations, and they question their own motivations more, that can in turn affect the way they behave in the future. And so in that way, I think it could be productive in that way. In terms of policy, I think obviously we need to take a good hard look at the war on drugs and the effects that this has had, and what are the motivations behind the disparities here. Why is it so much directed at subordinate males? There's no evidence that they're the ones that are using drugs or selling drugs at a higher rate than anybody else. And so, I just feel like even just bringing up these questions, people just aren't aware that this is the society that they live in, and take a lot of these things for granted.